The sound reaches him first. Morning, July 7th, 1944. A radio operator in the 105th Infantry Regiment feels the ground carry men before he sees a single shape in the dark. Saipan lies in the Mariana Islands, and the battle for the island had begun on June 15th. 3 weeks taught him enough. He already knew artillery by sound, by rhythm, by the way blast rolled over the line. This was different. North of Tanapag Harbor, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving through the sugarcane before dawn, and the noise came with shouting he had never heard on Saipan. His job was the radio. He kept the link open for the regiment, which belonged to the American 27th Infantry Division. Then the figures came clear, some walking, some running, others carried on litters by men who were barely still upright. Many held sharpened bamboo poles with bayonets tied to the ends, because the garrison had used up its ammunition and General Saito had chosen a final attack. It was coming straight at his position. He had a carbine on his shoulder because someone had issued one to a radio man, and he had chambered a round 3 days earlier without expecting to use it first. Not now. He pulls the carbine free. About 2.5 kilograms. That light carbine points to the next layer. The rush toward one radio operator came from a calculation Japanese commanders had shaped over years, long before Saipan and long before that dawn. This was not a plan for one island or one man. They judged American strength clearly. At range, American infantry was dangerous, and by 1944, U.S. landings leaned on naval guns, field artillery, and air support. Pacific Island fighting had already been running since 1942. Japanese officers knew they could not win a long exchange under that weight of fire. So they planned for the opposite moment. Cut the distance fast, hit before the first second settled. Force the fight into bodies, shock, and strip-second discipline. There, they believed, American firepower lost part of its edge, and the man holding the lighter weapon mattered more than the weapons behind him. Japanese commanders had already tested that calculation in Malaya in 1941 and 1942. Malaya gave proof. The campaign opened in December 1941, and by February 1942, Singapore had surrendered. Officers carried that result forward to Saipan. Japanese troops broke a British colonial army roughly twice their size through speed, infiltration, and close assault. Gyokusai meant a shattered jewel. These were real opponents. Soldiers drilled to keep moving while wounded, and talk that surrender ranked below death carried that method into battle. Each assault sought one gap. Then it drove into the American line. Once the break appeared, the real target stood behind it. American riflemen on the front carried M1 Garins with 8 rounds and semi-automatic fire. That front line hit hard. The rifle line stopped there. Behind them stood radio operators, medics, mortar crews, signalmen, and supply troops, whose main job was radios, wounds, ammunition, or mortar parts. Many carried M1911 pistols. Inside a room, that pistol was dangerous. At about 91 meters, against a fast-moving attacker, it gave poor odds to men whose main job was not marksmanship. Japanese assault planning aimed past the Garins and toward those support men, and the danger existed before the Army wrote a light rifle requirement. That vulnerability moved into Army paperwork before the war reached America, because rear area men needed more reach than a pistol gave. By 1938, 3 years before Pearl Harbor, the Army circulated requirements for a compact shoulder weapon for troops carrying other loads. Command wanted more range than a sidearm and less burden than the full infantry rifle. An unloaded M1 Garand weighed about 4.3 kilograms and measured about 1 meter 22 centimeters. For riflemen, it fit. Their whole job centered on carrying that weapon and using it under pressure. For the man with an 18-kilogram radio, a medical kit, or a section of mortar tube, the calculation changed. Other work came first. The Garand also asked for rifle training and conditioning, especially in close combat when speed and control broke down. That mattered under pressure. What looked manageable on paper became a command problem in the field. Guadalcanal turned that requirement into combat reporting. On Guadalcanal, the paper requirement met a perimeter fight in late 1942. Japanese forces probed and breached American lines at close range, where some soldiers had nothing effective beyond about 46 meters. Reports after the fighting moved up the chain of command and recorded what men met there, not what staffs had predicted. Men died in the space between a pistol's reach and a rifle's weight. Command needed a weapon to close it. That gap turned into a design brief, and in 1941, Winchester won acceptance. It became the M1 Carbine for soldiers with other jobs. The weapon fired a new .30 carbine round, pushing a bullet of about 7.1 grams and about 607 meters per second. That round stayed weaker than the Garand's .30-06 at any distance. Different job. Loaded, the carbine weighed about 2.5 kilograms and measured about 91 centimeters. It was semi-automatic. A 15-round magazine gave fast repeat fire, and a trained hand could change it in seconds. The paper answer was ready. The rear line would judge the rest. Now the design met the men behind the rifle line. For them, seconds decided everything. The United States adopted the M1 Carbine in 1941 for troops whose main job was not rifle combat, and its loaded weight stayed near 2.5 kilograms. Then, the alarm changed. That load could ride across one shoulder for 8 hours beside a radio pack or medical bag, then come down in less than 5 seconds. At 91 centimeters, the weapon cleared that extra gear without snagging. That was the point. The 15-round magazine gave one support soldier enough fire to hit several targets crossing 46 meters of open ground, with rounds still left. The .30 carbine cartridge, 7.62 by 33 millimeters, was weaker than the Garand round. But the Garand stayed with riflemen who carried little else. The carbine stayed with men carrying everything else. And in the last seconds before contact, it came off the sling and into the fight. Those saved seconds turned into a map error. A Japanese officer marked the American rifle line, counted rifles, judged its fire, and calculated the cost of breaking through. Men behind that line barely entered the estimate. That was the miss. The M1 Carbine gave those men with other duties a light weapon, and that blind spot began costing attackers lives before they hit the front. By night, the mistake reached headquarters. On Saipan, in the Mariana Islands, General Yoshitsugu Saito wrote his farewell message in a cave above Tanapag Harbor on the evening of July 6, 1944. American troops had landed on June 15th, and now they had broken the last defensive line. There was nowhere left to pull back. About 4,000 men could still form ranks. Some came straight from field hospitals, wrapped in bandages. Others arrived on litters, carried by men who could barely stand themselves. Saito ordered every man able to hold a weapon into the assault. While other officers formed the columns, he killed himself at his command post. Near 3 in the morning on July 7th, the attack crossed the line of departure. Minutes after the columns moved, the order reached American lines on Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Around 3 in the morning on July 7th, the Japanese assault hit the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, part of the 27th Infantry Division, across about 1 kilometer, 600 meters. The forward positions began to give way in the first hour. Japanese troops pushed through the gaps, slipped around pockets still firing in the dark, and drove into the rear the attack meant to crack at close range. But the rear had warning. Support sections heard the charge building for long minutes, and every man with a carbine already had it in his hands before the first wave reached them. That warning changed the fight at once. Once Japanese groups slipped past the front, range in the rear fell to about 90 meters, then 45, then less in the dark. At that distance, broken command mattered less than speed. Contact between units snapped. Men from separate sections formed temporary groups and fired beside men they barely knew. The carbine carried 15 rounds, which could not sustain a long exchange, but it could send quick semi-automatic fire into targets crossing close ground. That was enough for the first burst. Then the magazine ran dry. The weapon fit that kind of fight because speed mattered more than a long reserve of fire. A radio operator or supply clerk reached into a cargo pocket, pulled the next magazine, and kept the line firing. After one magazine emptied, the next came from that pocket. Those quick pocket reloads kept the rear firing, but the breach still cut through 1st Battalion, where William O'Brien fought. He started with a carbine. Then O'Brien took a pistol. Then he seized a jeep with a 12.7mm machine gun and fired standing at the ring mount until he was killed. He later received the Medal of Honor after his death, one of 2 awarded to men of the 105th for that morning. That part fit Army expectations. A battalion commander was supposed to keep fighting inside a break. What the attack met behind him was different. Radio operators, supply clerks, and medics firing back from the interior at close range. They had not come forward to lead charges. They were supposed to handle messages, stores, and bandages, yet they still held ground with weapons built for this distance. The charge kept moving until the attackers ran out of men. By gray dawn over Tanapag Harbor, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead across ground under 1.6 kilometers wide. The 105th Infantry had taken more than 600 casualties in a single morning, but its position held. The test ran deeper. Saipan checked an older Japanese assumption. Break the front rifle line, and the rear would fold fast. American tactical reports from the Middle Pacific kept showing the opposite. The fights varied too much for one easy explanation. Battles differed. The pattern did not. American defenses had more fighting depth than Japanese planners expected, so assault troops could breach the first line and still meet steady resistance behind it. After Japan surrendered in 1945, occupation authorities gathered post-war interrogations. In separate interviews, surviving Japanese officers described the same mistake again. They expected the American rear to stop shooting once the front broke. It did not. Even after the forward edge cracked, the rear kept firing. That persistent fire pushed Japanese briefings toward a smaller argument. They reduced the problem to the carbine cartridge, the .30 carbine round, 7.62 by 33 millimeters. Men who survived carbine hits sometimes said the cartridge had limits. Against a man still charging on momentum, one hit might not drop him at once. Later briefings used that point to steady assault troops. The comparison was narrowly true. A lighter round could fail to give an instant stop on one runner at close range. But that claim only worked if the fight stayed inside one body and one hit. The real failure sat on the map. Inside the American position, the radio man had a carbine, the medic had one, and the cook had one as well. The ammunition carrier had one too, and so did the rear man who had spent weeks logging call signs. That meant sustained self-loading fire could rise from the interior at exactly the short ranges a breakthrough force expected easy passage. So the issue was never one charging soldier. The issue was that fire now appeared from inside the line. Once carbines sat with radio men, medics, cooks, and ammunition carriers, the American rear was armed. That space behind the rifles could not stay open. So the carbine stayed. It remained in American service after the Second World War, fought in Korea in the early 1950s, and reached early Vietnam. Garand left first. American infantry moved to the M14, then the M16. The need did not vanish. Allied armies still carried the M1 Carbine for decades because it armed men who usually never received a rifle. That long service settled the argument over purpose. The M1 Carbine stayed with the man behind the rifle line. The man older doctrine treated as exposed once the front edge failed. The fear it caused went beyond ballistics. A banzai charge split an American position in two, with riflemen at the front and support men behind them. Japanese planning depended on crossing that strip and reaching weak ground on the far side. The M1 Carbine removed that ground, and the question became direct. When the rifle line gave way, the radio operator could fire back from the depth of the position. The answer weighed about 2.5 kilograms. It rode on the radio operator's back from Guadalcanal in the 1942 to 1943 campaign to Okinawa in 1945.